price elasticity, we're going to look at elasticity, but focusing mainly on price elasticity of demand. And then we'll touch briefly on supply, income, cross elasticity. Because they're pretty much the same. Once you understand the price elasticity of demand, you kind of get it. And then we'll talk about price controls. All right. So elasticity, if I were to describe it in very layman terms, is basically how much a change in one variable affects the change in the other variable. So usually in the econs kind of way, we kind of look at it as in terms of how the change in price affects the change in quantity, right? That's kind of like a layman speak, but of course, it's really to which the demand or supply is sensitive to changes. So it could be change in price or change in income or stuff like that, right? So how do we read? So for now, we'll just look at price elasticity of demand, because once you understand this, you can understand the rest. But how do we actually read a price elasticity of demand, right? So if somebody says the elasticity, the PD, price elasticity of demand, is 0, what does it mean? So it means that it's perfectly inelastic, right? No matter how much price changes, demand stays the same. Perfectly inelastic. Okay, so if it's inelastic, what does inelastic mean? Inelastic mean that even though I change my prices a lot, the change in quantity is very little. Okay, meaning that let's say the price of the price of my handphone that I produce, right? Josiah's handphones. The demand is very inelastic. Even if I increase the price by 25%, according to the normal theory, we would expect the drop in quantity to be 25%, right? But if it's less than 25%, it would mean that the demand is inelastic, right? The change in price is greater than the change in quantity. The reverse is true for elastic demands. So meaning that if, let's say, I drop my price by 10%, and then the quantity demanded increases by like 20%, I would say it's very elastic, right? Because a small change in price has a huge change in quantity demanded. And there's something called a perfectly elastic demand, meaning no matter how the price changes, the demand is basically insane, right? Yeah. So as long as the price is at this particular point, P1, the quantity is basically, there's almost no relationship between the quantity and price. So, but because it's a straight line and because it's in percentages, if let's say the change in price is always equals to the change in quantity, we call it a unitary elastic. So when that happens, you will actually end up with a little curve looking like that. Not too sure if it's exactly like that, but something like that. Yeah. Okay. So like I mentioned, price elasticity of demand, or PED, is basically the percentage change in quantity over the percentage change in price. So if it's bigger than 1, we say that it is very elastic, and if it's smaller than 1, we say it's inelastic. Did I say it correctly? Yeah, I said it correctly. Yeah. Okay. So for straight lines, straight line demand curves, the problem with straight line demand curves is because we are dealing with percentages. See, like a $2 change, right? From $2 out of $6 is 33%, but $2 out of, say, $18 is a very small percentage. It's slightly over 10%, right? So because we are dealing with percentages, what happens is that the price elasticity actually changes along the line because it's percentage, right? So the midpoint is where basically where the percentage change in price and the percentage change in quantity is the same. So anything above that is price elastic, anything below that is price inelastic. And this is not because of some special change in the demand itself. It's simply because it's a mathematical function, because you're dealing with percentages. So to kind of counteract this problem, we use a midpoint method. So midpoint method uses the midpoint as the denominator rather than the whole curve, because the curve changes, right? The elasticity changes along the curve. So if you use the midpoint method, your so-called your change is less, a lot less. The point of reference is just between those 2 points. So basically, it's the change in quantity over a midpoint divided by the change in price over a midpoint. All right. So we can use an example here to kind of give you an idea. Batarang initially sold $800, so Batman purchases 8,000 units of that. The quantity demanded is 8,000. But once the price fell to $600 P2, the quantity demanded now has increased to $16,000. So what's the price elasticity of Batarangs, right? So in that case, we can use a midpoint formula to kind of calculate this. So as usually, I would always encourage the facts to always be written out first. So we know that P1, the first initial price, P1, is $800. The new price is $600, P2. Initial quantity demanded is 8,000. The new quantity demanded is 16,000. So we find out the change in price. So it's P2 minus P1 over midpoint. We get 28%, 28.57%. Change in quantity, Q new quantity over less old quantity over midpoint. We get 66.67%. And we then calculate the change in quantity over change in price, 2.33. So we know that that this is relatively price elastic, right? Because basically the change in quantity is greater than the change in price. How do we calculate a midpoint? Graphically, this is how it kind of looks like. 600, 800, look at the middle point. You can use a formula if you want. So it's minimum plus maximum over 2. So you get, so in this case, you get 700. All right. So yeah, so what's so important about elasticity then? You know, PD allows us to actually predict revenue. And how and why? Why is that the case? Because it predicts price, right? And revenue is basically price times quantity. So revenue is how many things you have sold, basically, at what price, right? So if let's say I sold 1,000 cars at 35,000 each, so I have 350 million. So that's my revenue. Okay. So basically the changes in, so here we can kind of predict our revenue, what kind of revenue we're going to get based off the elasticity. So we know that here is going to be, so even if, so we know that over here, basically we're going to have a lot. And once at unit, after it passes unit elasticity, which is the peak of the revenue, we know that we will still earn, but we earn lesser and lesser, right? So that's basically the rate of revenue expected to increase will increase at a decreasing rate. So this gives us an idea of to what extent we should price our goods and what quantity, right? So if you're a business owner, this will help you if you're if you're calculating it, right? So what are the types of elasticity? So we'll speak quite briefly to it. So there's supply elasticity, change in price, how it affects supply. Income elasticity, how changes in income affect demand, right? Quantity demanded. Okay, so this is the one, cross elasticity is the one that's slightly more confusing. It's basically what happens when the price of one good changes. So if let's say good B changes the price, how would it affect the quantity demanded of good A? So if let's say the change in the price of oranges have now become more expensive, would this cause apples to be more demanded? If yes, if there's a relationship, we could say there's a cross elasticity of demand, right? So, okay, so we mentioned, so now we kind of understood the steepness of the curves, right? How steep or how shallow the curves are is because of elasticity and to some extent the shape as well. So now we understand that, we can look at price controls. Remember we mentioned that the governments can make interventions into the market. This causes the demands to shift or the supplies to shift, right? So we'll look at the blunt instruments before we look at the finer instruments. The blunt instruments are called price floors and price ceilings. So price floor and price ceilings are basically absolute tools, right? So a price ceiling is a max cap. So everything cannot be more than this particular price. So the government artificially sets the price low. So things like medicine, essentials, food, some food, government may purposely force the price to be low. So the government will pass a law that say like all bread cannot cost more than $5 a loaf, something like that. Okay, so it can only work if it's low, right? Because if it's high, if your if you set the price, let's say the market price of a bread is $6, and you set the max cap at $7, what's going to happen is everybody will buy bread at $6. So the ceiling becomes useless. So the reverse is true for a floor. Okay, price floor is a minimum cap, meaning that the prices must be at least a certain amount. So things like, say, minimum wage, right? So government gives a minimum wage of $22 per hour. So you must pay $22 per hour, okay, which is above the equilibrium price of, say, I don't know, $15 an hour. But if you set a minimum wage at, say, $12 an hour, what's going to happen? Now, there will be no effect, right? Actually, you may even cause prices to go down, or wages to go down. Okay, so what's the effect of a surplus or a shortage? There's actually a loss in efficiency. This loss in efficiency is simply because producers will not produce at the point of the PPC, of the production possibility frontier, simply because they're not incentivized to, right? They don't have that incentive to kind of produce right at the edge, and that loss is a loss in efficiency, and this loss in efficiency is known as a deadweight loss. All right. So in anything above the equilibrium line is a so-called a consumer surplus, anything that the consumer enjoys, and anything below is a producer surplus, right? But they are effectively inefficiencies. Okay, so like we mentioned, the price floor and price ceiling are very blunt tools. Are there finer tools? Yes, the finer tools are taxes and subsidies and other sort of instruments, right? But these are the more commonly seen one, taxes and subsidies, because they basically try to shift the demand by, if you can remember from the previous video, the determinant of demand and supply. So one of it is the business environment, right? And one of it is like, say, substitutes, right? So that's how the government tries to kind of influence the market. So by levying taxes, you basically reduce demand, or you increase, or you change, reduce demand by changing the business environment, or you basically reduce supply, right, by increasing cost of production. Yep. So supplies work the opposite way around. Sorry, substitutes work the opposite way around. So example we have here is a 50% tax is levied on combustion diesel cars, and a 50% substitute or subsidies on the electric cars, the substitutes. So what happens? So the demand drops, right? The demand shifts basically because of because it's more expensive. Less people want to buy. Change in business climate, right? So and then supply of the substitute cars go up, okay, because of the subsidies. So that causes supply to shift as well. And when that happens, the quantity demanded will go down and the costs will go up. Okay. So you can see initially, right, what happens? There was a tax, right? So demand shifted. Price will actually fall at this particular price because demand is lesser. Right? Producers want to encourage people to buy, but the quantity obviously would have gone down. But then the subsidies kick in for the substitute goods, and suppliers were now like, okay, let's not build diesel cars. What happens? Supply shifts. Okay, so when that happens, you end up with a new equilibrium price that is not as high as P2, but way higher than the equilibrium price at a much lower quantity demanded or produced. So that is a way that governments try to kind of encourage, say, the shift to electric cars, right? That's how we can see it. Okay, and with that, I'd like to end the video. Thank you, everyone. And yes.